Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of our Green Gatherings this morning. Apologies for the late start, but obviously, as you know, we're always waiting for others to join and give them a chance to come on board and sign up and join in to the Zoom. And we're now at 5 minutes past 9, going to kick it all off. This morning, we are busy talking about calculating your event's green carbon footprint. Grace Stead is going to take us through the how to do it part of the today's webinar, and we're all excited about learning how to calculate and what we need to do in order to calculate our event's carbon footprint. But before we kick that off, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to one of our new members and one of our brand new patron sponsor members. I would like to introduce you to Sandro Corrado. Good morning, Sandro.
Morning, John.
Welcome. Sandro is from Trigger, or otherwise known as GAWK. I don't know which way you want to be introduced, if you want to be introduced as GAWK or as Trigger, Sandro, either one or both?
Either one. It'll be clear in a few minutes.
Okay, fantastic. So we'll get to understand a little bit about Trigger and GAWK in a few minutes from Sandro. As I mentioned, Sandro is the director of Trigger and GAWK and one of our brand new EGF patron sponsors. So Sandro, I would like to say thank you very much for your contribution towards our patron sponsorship, and we welcome you as a patron and obviously as a very valuable member of the Event Greening Forum.
Thank you. It's an honor.
Thank you. Of course, it goes without saying that we would like to also congratulate and thank our sponsors for today's event, the Solutions Company and Event Synthesis. They are the sponsors, also patron sponsors, and they are today's sponsors of today's event. So without the Solutions Company and Event Synthesis, today's event would not be possible. So I'd like to thank them for their contribution as patron sponsors to be able to bring this fantastic event to us today. So Sandro, that's about it from my side. I'd like to hand over the presentation to you, please.
Thank you very much, John. And thanks to the EGF team for allowing us this platform just to share our journey with Trigger as what's really become a sustainable greening events product, so to speak. Before I dive into Trigger, let me just launch a small presentation here. Let's hope I don't mess this up. There we go. So I just want to give you some context of where. Hold on. There we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yep, we can see you.
Okay. So just to give you a little bit of context of where GAWK and Trigger fits in to the whole equation, and what Trigger is exactly. In 2003, I started my journey in the exhibition industry as a stand designer for a company called IDG. Some of you who have been around for a while might have remembered IDG. So cutting my teeth there in the first few years, I quickly realized two things. The first aspect of the industry, I was quite taken aback at how much energy went in to producing custom stands. And the other thing that stood out for me, which was really stark for me, was the incredible amount of wastage that the industry produced. As satisfying as it was to design and see these creations come to life, 3 days later they were effectively in a trash heap, and that bugged me. So in 2006, it motivated me to found a company called Pod Display, where our focus was really on portable branding solutions. That was early days. We didn't have massive ambitions, but I knew at the time that there was a better way to do events and to do exhibitions. Roughly at the same time, in 2008, my current partner, Alphonse Dutoy, who at the time was a product designer, actually mechanical engineer with a product design business, doing work for Armscor, Denel, and Eskom, developing various product solutions. He went on an expo abroad to showcase their services as Technimark, and he rented a portable system from South African company. One of our industry colleagues, unfortunately, is no longer with us. And his experience was pretty dire. He didn't have a great experience. The stand nearly collapsed on him. There was more focus on trying to get the stand erected and dismantled than on the reason why he was there. So when he got back to SA, he proposed to the supplier that he could probably design something a little bit better. And that's essentially how Trigger came about. So our first product in the range, Trigger Max, was invented in 2008. That's when I was first exposed to Trigger as a system. And the day that the demo was done to me, I was absolutely blown away. I immediately understood that this was the future of display. It was a low energy solution that was empowered users and really was very light on resources, but could do a lot. And I'll dive into the features of Trigger that really make it a unique, sustainable solution in the industry. As Pod, we adopted Trigger immediately, and pretty much by 2015, we were the #1 reseller of Trigger, not only in South Africa, but globally. At the time, Trigger was being exported to 2 markets in the UK and Australia, and we just dived in full on. We took it on board and we really focused on the product. In 2015, Alphonse approached us and offered, basically suggested that if we were interested in joining forces, so it's full stretch display and pod display, to form a combined business where we looked after the manufacturing, sales, and marketing of the product, and Alphonse would focus on the product development side. As an engineer, he wasn't too keen on running workshops and managing people. For us, it was an absolute no-brainer. In 2016, we formally merged pod display and full stretch display, and that's essentially how GAWK came about in the market. The few years after we joined, we had good constant growth. 2 years after, or a year and a half after our merger, we re-looked at Trigger as a system, and we listened to our market and to our customers, and we redesigned Trigger from the ground up. So we took all the features that worked from the original system, Trigger Max, and essentially we developed Trigger Go, which was half the components, half the weight, and 40% cheaper, and really catered to the needs of our market, as they saw the system working for them. At the outset, when we launched Trigger Go, we were concerned. It is a premium product. We were competing in a portable branding market, as well as the custom side of the industry, and we were concerned that we would struggle to sell the system well. We were proven absolutely wrong, and we learned a lesson. Our first lesson with Trigger was that if you design a premium product, it's not about cost, it's about value, and it's about what it gives back. And if you have a solution that is going to last people, or last your customers, instead of something that's disposable, it absolutely makes sense in the long term. Not only does it make sense for them from a cost perspective, but it makes sense sustainably from a greening point of view as well. And then COVID hit. When COVID hit, Trigger took a 98% hit in our sales. We absolutely got hammered. We had to use our design skills to hustle, much like everyone else in the industry, and we managed to get through that. One of the good things to come out of COVID, however, was the product was recognized by the European Product Design Association, and we won the European Product Design Award for 2020 in our category for Trigger Go. And that was a great pat on the back, and it just motivated us to keep pushing forward with the solution. As I mentioned, we were already exporting trigger to various markets globally, and we had a distributor in the United States, but we just didn't have the penetration that we were after with that particular distributor, and it wasn't quite clicking. So in 2023, sorry, got a dry mouth there. In 2023, Alphonse went on a US kind of trip, basically, to source new suppliers, and that's where we met Showdown Displays, which is one of the biggest display hardware suppliers in the United States. Signed a contract with them at the end of 2023, beginning of 2024, and we're prepping Trigger Go for US distribution, which is leaving mid-October. But the big thing with the USA experience is that we were forced to really look at Trigger on a microscopic level, literally. I mean, when we sent our samples to them, they sent all of our materials for lab testing, and came back with a report where Trigger passed probably 80 to 90%. And there were some materials that we were using that didn't pass muster, that were not healthy. And it forced us to relook at some of our materials, change the materials in our system, and it forced us to become 100% compliant with their FDA laws and health regulations. So it's it really put us in a situation where we had to look really closely at Trigger at all levels, from a health point of view, sustainability, and obviously the value proposition. So what is Trigger, essentially? Well, the textbook says, or our instruction manual says, it's a toolless, flat pack, modular textile display system. The way I like to describe it to customers when we demo it is that it's essentially like Lego for the exhibition and display market. So utilizing, just going to get my pointer here, utilizing these 6 components here, which is 2 upright sections that join a top and a bottom crossbar. It's a bracing to stabilize the system, feet. Those 6 components, we can essentially build anything that you see below here. So everything from booths to towers to counters to kind of shell scheme type structures, back walls that can be from 1 module to 100 modules. There is no limit. It's essentially a toolkit to be creative. What is unique about Trigger is that there are a lot of systems that support textile prints. We've paid a lot of attention. I can't see it because I've got a text box on the right here, but if you see on the right of my screen, at the very top of this panel here, there's a tensioning device. And that tensioning device, you also see it down here, works like a big pen. It's sprung. So when you set your graphic into the rails on the system, top and bottom, and then activate the tensioners, it tensions the print so that they're presented in a professional way. And it's pretty much flat. So that's essentially how it works. So those 6 basic components empower users to really produce extremely versatile and creative solutions. Why is that important in a sustainable kind of context? Is that flexibility is key with a system. You don't want to restrict an end user or limit them in terms of what they are able to do or present with a system. The more options you give people, the longer the system hangs around. It has better durability. It's got a longer lifespan. There's less chance of it ending up in a dump or a trash heap, essentially. When Trigger was designed, from our backgrounds, Alphonse is a mechanical engineer, and from a product design perspective and the development process, from my background and collaborators who are also industrial designers, we looked at the design of Trigger from a product design perspective and an engineering perspective. And there's certain principles in product design that are important. So we look at things like product lifestyle management. We look at materials. We deeply look at materials specifically. We look at the way the system is going to be manufactured. We look at ways the system is going to be used. And all of these things kind of feed in to a sustainable ecosystem. You know, we have these things drummed into our heads when we're learning about product design. And that's important, you know, selecting materials for a system and understanding exactly what's going into a system, not only from a material point of view, but also from a manufacturing perspective, and that whole cradle to grave cycle. So it's all well and good developing and designing a system that you sell off and make a cause of money, but then what happens afterwards? You know, where does it end up? What kind of impact does it have on its surroundings, on the environment? Are the materials recyclable? If they are, great, but can the system be disassembled easily to isolate all the individual materials so that they can be easily recyclable? Low energy kind of inputs perspective. So that's the approach that we took designing Trigger, and it was an intensive process. It took hundreds of hours of design and a lot of sweat equity and failures to understand and to get the system working correctly. Trigger is manufactured from sustainable materials rather. The core components of Trigger are aluminium, and I'll talk a little bit about aluminium a little bit later on. It is an energy intensive material to produce, but it has some unique characteristics, and it actually is sustainable. The plastics we use are ABS and nylon, essentially, in our connectors, and our prints are 100% polyester, which not only is a low energy material to produce, it's recyclable, but more importantly, it can be quite easily upcycled into amazing products. Importantly, so more important than the whole engineering process going into Trigger and understanding all these sustainable products and techniques and methods and manufacturing processes is that Trigger is not a disposable system. It's designed to last. We give a 2-year manufacturer's guarantee on the system, which is easy for us because it doesn't easily break. We've got clients who have purchased Trigger at inception in 2008 and still using their system 16 years later. That is the critical point. Quality and endurance in a product are huge features when it comes to sustainability, because if you produce something that someone is likely to hang on to, it's unlikely, obviously, that they're going to discard it very soon or cycle through disposable products very often. So their usage and the usage volumes drop dramatically. Obviously, you need to make a business case out of it. And with Trigger, you know, our business model is set around, once a client owns the hardware, we have the consumable, so to speak, which is the textile print, which we've also thought carefully about in terms of sustainability, and that keeps coming. And typically, clients who invest in a Trigger ecosystem will start with a module, and it can be any system. It can be Trigger, it can be Octanorm, you know, it can be B-Matrix or AluVision. You know, these reusable systems, it's key that when people invest in it and they buy into it, they tend to stick with it for quite a long time and they build onto it. So there is an absolute business case for it. It's not like producing hardware and you'll never see them again. Trigger fits into an interesting space between portable and custom display. And it's an important space that we feel that is not kind of really catered for in the industry sufficiently, we feel. So large custom displays are well taken care of. The very small kind of package setups are taken care of. But in between is a difficult space, and that's where Trigger fills that space quite nicely. And again, from a sustainability point of view, the bulk of exhibition stands at a venue are not your 100, 200 square meter custom stands. They are the smaller sub 50 square meter stands, where people are using a lot of disposable solutions to fill that space and to market themselves, which is not necessarily sustainable. Another important factor in portable systems like Trigger is how compact they can be packed. That is absolutely critical. And there are some systems that are reusable and sustainable in a sense, but they fail when it comes to logistics. You don't want to be transporting lightweight, compact, portable, flat pack products in gas guzzling superlink trucks. You want to be able to pack them down as small as possible, where you empower the end user to literally pack them into the boot of their car, or you can pack multiple stands into a very small delivery vehicle where you reduce that footprint. You don't want to be transporting air, and that's something we've looked very carefully at. Our principles when it comes to trigger is it has to be flat pack, it has to be toolless, and it has to be portable. But portable, literally with a person's hands, where they can sling it onto their back. And in the case of a standard 9 square meter stand, trigger does exactly that. That's 9 modules. 9-module system would weigh 45 kilos. People could pack it into check-in baggage on an aircraft, literally. They might pay a little bit of excess luggage if they're not traveling with anyone, but it is absolutely portable. They can pack it into an Uber and they can build their own exhibition stand at the destination. And kind of maximizing on that space is absolutely critical, because you don't want to be transporting air and emitting, carbon at the same time while you're doing it. So I've mentioned that it's important to empower the user. Going directly to the user, empowering them to build their own stands eliminates a lot of logistical wastage in between, where you've got unnecessary delivery vehicles, drayage or porters at destinations. In the US and Europe, those are very expensive costs. So all of the features that I've mentioned around trigger really kind of lend itself to a low emission and low carbon environment, where we've looked at that whole kind of circular economy from its inception and what's going to happen to it when it eventually does get discarded. We don't want trigger to be discarded. We want it to be recycled and then re-enter that economy as a new product again. And that all feeds into looking at it from a PLM perspective, applying kind of energy and your mind before you actually waste any resources in developing the product, to think all of these things through. And that process can be applied even to custom stands. So for the custom builders out there, or the contractors, if you're going to produce MDF based solutions or custom stands for clients, think about what you're going to do when after strike. What's going to happen to all of those components? Are they going to end up in a trash heap? MDF isn't a cool material. You don't really want it in a trash heap. So what are you going to do with it afterwards? Or is there a better solution? Just looking a little bit more closely. So these are just some examples in terms of trigger. So as a portable system, it doesn't have to be a banner wall. No portable systems or system-based solutions don't need to look, they don't need to look modular and generic. They can really be presented in a professional way. And just some examples from the top left here. This was a stand that we sent through to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, which was erected by engineering students with instructions. We never received a phone call from them. It was a 10-meter diameter kind of maze in Trigger Max and textile that was shipped in 5 crates and sent to Jeddah. And we didn't, as I said, they had no problem setting it up. 30-meter backdrops, shell scheme type setups, testing booths, large structures up to 3.5, 4 meters high. So, Trigger Max can go up to 6 meters high if we needed to, and custom booths. These all can be packed down, very compact into bags. When they reach the end of their life, they can be repurposed and recycled again. So just moving quickly on, I see I'm a little bit pressed for time, so I'm going to move through this quite quickly. Why did we join the EGF? Well, for us, it was an absolute no-brainer. For starters, we really connect with the values of the EGF around people, planet, and prosperity and sustainability. We didn't set out to save the planet. That wasn't our intention. We set out to develop a system that just made sense in the bigger scheme of things. And in many ways, Trigger led us on a journey. And part of that journey was learning about the EGF and understanding what their mission and their cause was. And that's something that really kind of resonated and connected with us. Again, as a platform for industry-minded or like-minded industry colleagues, it's an important platform for us to share, but more importantly, to learn from our contemporaries and our colleagues in the industry. You can't tackle a problem like this individually and with your head kind of stuck in the ground, it has to be a collective. And with collective input, we can kind of reach the target and reach the solution a lot quicker than if we had to try and tackle it on our own. The EGF gives us access to global thought leadership and global trends, which is critical. Again, feeding into that collective solution. There's a lot of things happening. Global warming and environmental destruction is not an isolated issue. It's not South Africa. It's a global problem, and the EGF creates that network where we can tap in to these thought leaders and these trends and understand what is happening, and maybe even contribute from our side to arrive at the solution a lot more efficiently. And most importantly, it's personal. For us, myself and Alphonse, we want to create or leave a legacy that our kids really care about. We don't want our kids to kind of look back and say, well, you've left us a massive problem. What did you actually do? We want them to look back and say, you did good. Thanks for trying. Thanks for actually taking into consideration our children and their future, and getting your A into G and actually doing something about it. That's important. And I think with the collective and the membership and the commonality we have in the EGF, like-minded people, it really helps us to get onto that tack and leave a legacy that counts. In terms of sustainability and a circular economy on Trigger, there's two really key elements that feed into that circular economy. For us, there's the principles of the 3 R's of reducing, reusing, recycling. In addition to that, looking at materials very closely, combining the two, and then having a business model that kind of feeds into itself. And how does that work for us? Specifically in the context of Trigger. Sourcing and utilizing reusable systems. That's key. I've mentioned it before. If you can reuse a system again and again and again, you're automatically minimizing wastage. If you have versatility in that system, you're not locked into a generic solution every single time. You have the freedom of creativity. You have the freedom to impress, yet at the same time, you are not overloading the kind of the energy load on the environment. A design for disassembly is a key factor. It's all well and good using recyclable materials, but if those materials are composite materials that are basically kind of welded together in a sense, so if you look at something like a toothbrush, it's got 2 different types of plastics in it. Those plastics are individually recyclable, but it's incredibly difficult to recycle them because you have to separate those materials. So the easier you make a product to disassemble and to recycle, the better it is in the bigger picture. Looking at materials very closely. Not all materials are made equally. Even though, as an example, PVC is a recyclable material, it's nasty. PVC, when you burn it, it produces chlorine gas. They used chlorine as a weapon of mass destruction in World War I. When chlorine combines with air moisture, you get hydrochloric acid. Yet PVC is a recyclable material. These things need to be considered. We need to look closely at what materials we're using and what risks we are presenting when we work with these materials to the public and to our own staff working in our workshops, inhaling dust and who knows what's in there. Well, I do know, but I'm not going to harp on that. Looking at materials for recyclability, important. How easily can they be recycled? Something that we've learned in the last year or so is that as widely used as acrylic is, it's not an easy material to recycle. It's recyclable, but you need heavy presses to press that material at high pressures for it to be recycled properly. There's 2 or 3 recyclers in South Africa who aren't taking in material because they can't offload it, because there's no one that can a lie. There is. Polyvantis, who produces plexiglass, do recycle acrylic. They're the only ones. And they've got a program where they will uplift their own product, take it back to their factory, regrind it, and they produce a material called ProTerra, which is a lower cost recycled acrylic. But look carefully at the materials and understand deeply whether they can be recycled or not, and how much energy goes into that recycling. Insisting on durability and quality, kind of tapping back to endurance. It's not about quality. You pay for quality, and quality delivers again and again in terms of value over the long term. So it's not about buying cheap. It's about buying intelligently. And if you buy quality, it will return its value over time, more so than buying cheap initially. Minimizing over-dependence on logistics. If you can cut out a logistical process, it goes a long way to reducing that footprint in terms of emissions, greenhouse gases, and so on. So look at your product solutions and understand: are you transporting air? Is there a better way to do it? Can we make it modular? Can we make it compact? Can we make it flat pack? It does take a little bit more effort individually, but it does pay dividends in the end. And eco products don't have to look like a tree to be green. You can achieve really kind of cutting edge design, visual feasts, by using solutions that are environmentally sensitive. They don't have to be made out of bamboo and hemp. There are many materials which lend themselves to a sustainable environmental solution. Just focusing on our core materials, looking at aluminium, and I mentioned it earlier. Aluminium does take a lot of energy to produce from virgin, but it takes a significantly less energy to recycle. And there's a comment by a gentleman by the name of Trond Christofferson. He's the head of recycling at a company called Hydro Aluminium. And he says, why does aluminium matter so much for the circular economy? Since it came into the market in 1825, about 1 billion metric tons of aluminium have found their way into a multitude of goods in our lives. And astonishingly, about 75% of it is still in use today. Why? Because there's fewer metals that are stronger, more durable, more useful than aluminium. It can be machined, formed, shaped. It's second only to copper in conductivity, conducts heat well, is non-sparking, resists corrosion and rust, and is non-magnetic. He says it can also be recycled over and over again without losing its properties, making aluminium an ideal metal for circular and low carbon economy. Aluminium is a wonder material, and there's a reason why 75% of it still exists in products today. So yes, it does use a lot of energy to produce, but it pays back huge dividends over time. Recyclable plastics, just one product. I'm not going to go through all of them, but if we look at textiles like polyester, using fabric, printed fabric versus PVC. Firstly, it's a low energy fabric to produce. Second to linen, just as an example, wool requires nearly 14 kilos or produces nearly 14 kilos of carbon dioxide to produce per measure, which I think was 150 grams, or need to double check that. But the point is that polyester is a low energy material to produce. It is recyclable, but importantly, what we do as a textile system-based manufacturer is we offer a service to our clients where we can upcycle our products. So once a client is done with their skin on their system, whether it's a text frame that you've used on a system or in your Octanorm or in your trigger system, we offer to convert those prints into shopper bags, wine coolers, lunch boxes, you name it. And it's a great giveaway, either to staff or clients, at the end of a show or an event. And that just kind of extends the usefulness of the material over time. Another thing we like to do is on our latex printers, we convert our print cartridges into bird feeders. Again, just expanding the lifetime of the product. In closing, I'd just like to leave you with this image. This is our current reality. And this was a photo taken a few days ago in Harrismith. The question that I pose to you and what I'll leave you is, this is not something that we want to occur often. And it's important for us to really, motivate ourselves and be the change that we want to see in our industry. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandro. That was an absolutely incredible presentation. I think we learned a hell of a lot, not only about the Trigger Go product and GAWK, but also about your journey and your commitment to sustainability. So thank you very much for that. And I think you've also taught us a little bit about sustainable materials, which goes back to one of our previous webinars where we spoke about materials in the eventing and the activations and exhibition industry. So thank you very much for that. I know we are a little bit over time, but we did start a little bit late. So I wanted to give you the full amount of time that you had for your presentation. So thank you again, Sandro. Really,
Thank you, John.
And I also want to once again thank you for your commitment to the EGF. It's really amazing to see our partners, and particularly our patron partners, that have such a big commitment to sustainability. It's one of the things that I was talking about at our marketing meeting yesterday, is that the amount of members' commitment and seeing them implement actually green principles. It's one thing being a member of the EGF. It's another thing when you actually walk your talk. And I'm proud and pleased to say that from what you've shown us, it looks like GAWK and Trigger Go are definitely walking the talk.
Thank you. Yeah, and we're always open to talk to anybody about the journey and just to help people. You know, I mean, it's not 100% there. We're always learning as well. But thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I know as we are, as I said earlier, running a few minutes behind schedule, but I'm sure we are now all very excited to hear from Grace Stead from Steadfast Greening, about the carbon footprinting and how we go about calculating or determining our carbon footprint within the industry that we operate in. So without any further ado, and I know Grace is going to she's worked very hard on her presentation, so she's going to be given the same amount of time to finish. So we will run over a bit on our time schedule, but I'm sure you will all be happy to stay online until Grace is finished with her presentation. So without any further ado, good morning, Grace. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody, and good morning, John. Thank you so much. It's great being here again. I think this is the third in the series that we're doing today. We've looked at waste and we've looked at energy, and today we're actually looking at carbon footprinting. The presentation that I've got here, and I can, sorry, let me maybe just, does it work do I need to switch my camera on, or do we just focus on the presentation? Is that fine? Because I am here, everybody, but let me rather just focus on the presentation. That might be easier. Okay. So, what I'm looking at here is really just a few key questions that I'm going to run through today. What are greenhouse gases? What is a carbon footprint? What are indicators? What are the boundaries? What are emission factors? How do you calculate the impact? And what about carbon offsetting? So each one of these are different building blocks of ultimately understanding your carbon footprint and being able to actually calculate your own carbon footprint. The level of the presentation, I really find it difficult to know where to peg it, because on the one hand, this is not the easiest thing to understand. So bear with me if everything's not very clear the first time around. But on the other hand, I am trying to simplify things. So any experts in the room, also please forgive me. I need to look at a common denominator around trying to simplify it sufficiently while still keeping the integrity. So I'm going to be focusing on a few of the core elements. The examples that I am using is for an event, and then also for a hotel, just as two different examples, or for a venue as two different examples. So I'm going to be looking into that. And then I often talk about indicators of boundaries and things like that, and people don't understand what it all means. And in preparation for the presentation, I try to also unpack what are the things that you actually really need to understand. And while if I'm going through it and it doesn't quite make sense, just believe me when I say at the end of the day, it's like the building blocks come together and you need to understand all the different pieces of these building blocks. So I'm going to just unpack these building blocks one by one. And then hopefully by the end of my presentation, I'm hoping that you will have a basic idea to understand so that you can go and look at what do you want to do about your carbon footprint for your business, for your event, so that you can go out and identify which indicators you want to measure, where you draw the boundaries, and then how you actually calculate the impact. Okay, so with that, I'm going to just start with the first question that I've got, and you'll see every time I've got a question, I'm going to address it, and then I'll do a summary on that. So what are greenhouse gases? So starting with that one. This is something that we actually all learned at school, and we know this. The sun is our primary energy source. The atmosphere is like an insulator that keeps in greenhouse gases such as carbon or methane. And then you've got your greenhouse gases that actually trap the heat, and it leads to global warming or climate change. The way that I often explain this is, what's it like when you park your car outside on a hot summer's day? It's warmer inside the car than outside the car. And why would that be? Because of the glass. So what happens is if your car is outside in the sun rays can come through the glass windows, and it heats up the inside of the car. However, the heat can't escape from the car. It can't get through the windows. And so the car heats up on the inside. This is typically also what you do with a greenhouse. We don't have as many greenhouses in South Africa as what they would have in Europe. But the whole idea is that the glass actually helps to trap the heat. And that is also why it is called a greenhouse gas. And this is what's happening is as we are putting more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it is as if we are making the glass around the earth thicker and thicker. And that is leading to global warming or climate change. Okay, so moving on from there, just a quick snapshot. If you look all the way back to 1815 through to more recent, you can see how the global fossil carbon emissions have increased over time. And you can see the black line is where it is all cumulatively. And yeah, this just gives an idea of one of the things of it, how it's impacted over time. So if we look at the greenhouse gases, there are various greenhouse gases, but the four major greenhouse gases that we look at is water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And of those four, water vapor, fortunately, it's the largest greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, but it has remained mostly unchanged over the last few thousand years. And fortunately, humans have not managed to damage that one yet. So that one's still scot-free, but the other three that we are actually impacting on significantly is carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And those are also the three main greenhouse gases that we measure. There are others as well, but I'm going to just keep things simple and focus on the main ones. Something else that I'm just needing to explain is that all gases are not equal. So if you look at your greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide is actually got a global warming potential of 1. So what that means is that carbon dioxide is not the culprit. Carbon dioxide is the measuring tool. So when Jan van Riebeeck came to Cape Town and they were measuring things, they had what they called the Dutch foot. That was a certain length. And then the British came and they had the imperial foot, and that was a little bit smaller, and everybody had a different size foot. So then they decided, okay, let's make it a meter, and we'll all know what we refer to when we say 1 meter. Except the Americans, they still don't know what a meter is. But for the rest of the world, we figured out what a meter is. We know what a kilometer is. we know how the system works. When they started measuring greenhouse gases, everybody was measuring it in a different way. Then at one stage, somebody said, well, okay, let's just use carbon dioxide as the yardstick. And we take everything compared to carbon dioxide. So methane, for example, is 21 times, let me say, worse than than carbon dioxide, because methane has got a global warming potential 21 times bigger than carbon dioxide. And so you've got nitrous oxide, which is 310 times worse than carbon dioxide. And it goes down. You can see some of these have got really high global warming potentials. The other thing that you need to understand is the atmospheric lifetime in years. So how long will this greenhouse gas actually be in the atmosphere and have the impact that it's got? So carbon dioxide, as you can see, will be in the atmosphere between 50 to 200 years, while a methane gas would be in the atmosphere potentially only for up to 2 years. Something like nitrous oxide could be in the atmosphere for 120 years. So there are various things for you to consider when you look at the greenhouse gases. Some of them are there for a shorter or a longer period of time, and some of them have got a larger or a smaller impact. Now, to enable us, again, to measure all of this, we bring it all down to what we call CO2e, so carbon dioxide equivalent. So if it is methane, and we know that's 21 times worse, we just basically bring it all back down to carbon emissions equivalent. And that is essentially what we are measuring in a carbon footprint, so that it all comes back to a single unit that we can actually engage with. Okay, it's not that we're only measuring carbon, and it's not that carbon is the culprit. If you stop breathing, because you breathe in oxygen, you breathe out carbon dioxide, don't think it's going to help if you stop breathing. It won't help. It won't change the scenario. Carbon dioxide is not the culprit. So where do all these greenhouse gases actually come from? As you can see here, a lot of them come from production of different products, the whole process around that. The generation of electricity is also quite a significant contributor, also because there a lot of fossil fuels are used. Agriculture, and that is also specifically because of the fertilizers that are used, but then also in transport, that would again be most of the fossil fuels being used, such as diesel or petrol or whatever is used for transport. And then heating and cooling, which is also specifically related to air conditioning and food storage, where you use your wow, falling over my words. But basically, these are gases that are used in very small amounts, but have quite a significant carbon footprint at the end of the day. So if we look at it here, it's the culprits at the bottom of the list that will be in the atmosphere for very long, and will have quite a much bigger global warming potential. So but specifically your HFCs. Okay, so that is also why heating and cooling specifically is so critical, and why air conditioners are actually also an issue. Okay, so that's looking at the sources of greenhouse gases, but just also moving on from there, I want you to start to think that, okay, so if you're looking at your business, whether you are looking at an event, whether you are looking at accommodation, or a venue hosting an event or something like that, where you need to identify which are the sources in your establishment that actually also create greenhouse gases. Where do those greenhouse gases actually come from? And once you can start to identify that, then you can start to say, okay, how do we actually measure that? Here you can see this is a monthly global mean temperature from 1851 through till 2020. Every circle is a year, and within this year you can see 12 different blocks January through to December, and you can see where the blue are the colder average temperatures for the whole world, and the dark red are warmer temperatures. So this just shows you how temperatures have actually increased year on year since 1851. So, wrapping up on greenhouse gases. There are many different types of greenhouse gases, but what I want you to really start to understand is, what do you actually need to measure, and how do you know what you actually include or exclude? When you look at what you measure, you consider the indicators, okay? And when you need to understand what is included or excluded, you look at the boundary, because this helps you to enable the measuring of your carbon footprint. And what you're actually measuring there are your indicators, which are then used to determine your carbon footprint. Okay, so that's just a brief introduction to greenhouse gases. Moving on from there, what is your carbon footprint then? So, your carbon footprint is the estimated amount of carbon dioxide equivalent that is created whenever you drive your car, you fly, you buy food, you heat your home, you have a hot shower, you have a cup of coffee, you have a cold beer, whatever you do, switching a light on and off. All of these different activities contribute to your own carbon footprint. Some of these activities might have a large impact over a short period of time. For example, if you take a flight, 2 hours Cape Town to Joburg, that's 620 kilograms of carbon emissions, just like that. So large impact over a short period of time, where other have got more smaller repetitive activities, such as we switch on the lights, we boil the kettle without even thinking twice about that. But it does have a cumulative effect. And while the actual light doesn't use very much, if you think about the fact that you've got lights throughout your house or your event or your hotel, and you consider that you switch them on without thinking about that, and it happens every day and it happens for a few hours in a day, the cumulative effect can be quite significant. So all of these different activities that you do actually contribute towards your own carbon footprint. Now, I also just want to differentiate between the active carbon pool and the fossil carbon pool, because on the one hand, you've got the active carbon pool, that is the atmosphere, the ocean, and the forests. We learned about photosynthesis. We learned all this basic stuff at school. Okay. Now, the difference is that you also get the fossil carbon pool, and that is the oil, the coal, and the gas. And that is called fossil fuels because it has taken such a long time to actually create the fossil fuels. It is actually created over millennia where, sorry, just a moment. Charlie boy, come my boy, Charlie, settle down. So what's happening there is that hey, Charlie boy, that's Gaia. It's okay. It's okay. Sorry, I've got some entertainment on this side. So with the fossil carbon pool, because it takes so long to actually create these fuels, they're known as fossil fuels. Now, what I'm trying to explain to you here is the difference between the active carbon pool and the fossil carbon pool, because we are continuously extracting from the fossil carbon pool to actually run our daily business. We need oil, coal, gas, petrol, diesel to run our business, to run our electricity, to run our vehicles, to do whatever we're doing. And the problem is that we can't put it back into the fossil carbon pool at the same rate as what we are actually extracting it from the fossil carbon pool. So the active carbon pool is getting overloaded with too much carbon emissions. So it's increasing. So whereas normally the oceans, the atmosphere, the forests, they can be in sync, they can manage themselves and it would be fine. As humans, we come along, we extract from the fossil carbon pool into the active carbon pool, and we can't put it back at the rate at what we're extracting. And that is the reason why planting trees is not enough. This is the reason why we have to look at alternative options for renewable energy as well, and looking to see how do we move away from the fossil fuels. So when we look at greenhouse gas emissions, the first thing, as I explained earlier on, is that there are some major greenhouse gases that we actually look at. So I've mentioned carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, and then there are some of the others that are also specifically used in air conditioning, and that can have quite a big impact, although they are only used in small quantities. So those are the main greenhouse gases that are sort of measured on for a normal carbon footprint. Okay, what I'm explaining here is in terms of the corporate greenhouse gas corporate protocol. All this information is available online. You can easily just Google corporate protocol, and you can download the protocol documents and everything associated with it. Okay, now something that often comes up is what are you reporting on, scope 1, 2, or 3? So I want to just touch on that for a moment. Now, scope 1 is your company owned and managed facilities. That is typically the building that you have. So if you are a hotel, it will be the hotel's building, or a house, it will be your own house. An office, it will be your office facility, especially if you manage or own them. The space that you occupy. So from a building point of view, what is the space that you occupy? And then it will also look at your vehicles. So personally, your personal carbon footprint will look at your own vehicle that you drive. Is it a big diesel guzzler, or is it a smaller, more efficient vehicle? Your company will look at the company carbon footprint. What is the company owned and managed vehicles? You'll look at, whatever it is. The question here for scope 1 is, what are the direct emissions that are company owned and managed? Okay, so that is what falls under scope 1. Then you get indirect, which we call scope 2. And that is basically the purchase of electricity. So in South Africa, that is mainly your Eskom generated electricity. It does include some other things also for heating and cooling and that. But the main thing here really is just your electricity that you're purchasing from Eskom. Okay. In South Africa also, JSE listed companies are required to report on scope 1 and 2. So those are the main things that we're looking at. And for the purpose of this exercise, I'm also focusing on scope 1 and 2. You do, however, also get scope 3. And scope 3 is quite often excluded, but the reality is, from an events perspective, scope 3 is where most of the events emissions lie. So you get on the left-hand side, scope 3 indirect is upstream activities. These are all the activities that actually happen leading into your business. So that would be purchase of goods and services, transport and distribution, getting products to your business, waste generated in the operations, the business travel, employee commuting, leased assets. So that is all things that sort of are upstream and that are feeding into your business. On the other hand, you've got scope 3 downstream activities, transport and distribution. So if you're actually manufacturing something and then you are distributing it afterwards, that is part of your downstream activities. The use of the product sold, the end of life treatment of the sold product. So if you actually manufacture something that needs to be disposed of, thrown away at the end of the day, that comes into your downstream activities, leased asset, franchisees, investments. So there are various things that fall under scope 3. But typically, if you look at it from an events perspective, very few events actually own and manage their own facility. So a conference venue, for example, they will look at scope 1 and 2. They'll have their carbon footprint of their events facility and the vehicles associated with that, and then the electricity used. but then the people that are actually using the venue, moving in and out, that actually falls under scope 3 for the venue. But if you're coming in as a event organizer, then you look at it slightly differently, and you look at it, what is it that you need to be able to make this event happen? And then associated with that as well, what is under your control? So specifically with events, it becomes very tricky to differentiate between scopes 1, 2, and 3. And that's also the reason why I'm referring to something like a hotel, because a hotel is a little bit more clear cut, where you can say, there's the hotel, there's the building, there's our vehicle that we use, and there's the electricity that we purchase. We can own and manage that. But then getting the guests to actually get to where you are, everything associated with preparing the meals, with the waste that's created there, and everything upstream and downstream, that then falls under scope 3. But what I'd like to encourage you to do is to look at it, what it is that you can actually measure again, okay? So try and focus on whatever is practical within your scope. This is just an extract from the Netball World Cup. So here we said, and you can see on the left-hand side in the middle, the direct sources that were actually controlled or owned by the Netball World Cup. There was very little that they actually owned, because it was an event essentially, and they did own certain things, but not very much in the bigger scheme of the event. Then scope 2 was the indirect energy that was used at the venue specifically. And then the largest scope was scope 3, and that was the flights, the accommodation, transport, freight, diesel, waste, water, catering, everything else associated with the event fell under scope 3. That's just as an example for you there. There is, however, another way also of looking at this. The first example that I gave you was in terms of the greenhouse gas corporate protocol, which is most commonly used. But what NZCE, the Net Zero Carbon Emissions Initiative, is looking at is trying to look at it more from a product and a life cycle protocol. This is a little bit different, and it is quite new. But I wanted to just touch on this but I also wanted to touch on the corporate protocol so that you can understand the different scopes. However, when you look at it from a product or life cycle protocol, you actually take a different approach. And what you see here is that you've got events that happen prior to the actual activity. So traveling to the destination, your freight and logistics, the production of everything associated with an event, the food and beverage and digital content communication that also is prepared beforehand. And with all of that, you've got energy associated with it as well. Then you've actually got, during the event, a whole set of activities. Again, you've got food and beverage, digital content. You've also got the accommodation and local transportation to actually get to the event. And again, you've got energy associated with that. Then at the end of the event, you look again at what is left over, what is the waste that comes out of it, what is the energy associated with dismantling that whole event, and then also taking things back to where it came from, the freight, the logistics, everything associated with it. So when you look at it from a time-based point of view, and you look at the different activities, you actually have a different approach in a way, but also to make sure that you're actually looking at it from a time-based approach. Just looking at this in detail, you've got your production and materials, you've got food and beverage, digital content and communication, accommodation, local transport. It moves across to waste, freight and logistics, travel to and from the destination, as well as energy. And those are the main things that we need to ensure that we include into carbon footprinting when we look at it from a events point of view. And this is also the methodology that NZCE is actually working on at the moment. Okay, so trying to just look at this one point. Oh, it's a bit annoying. I've got this thingy in my screen all the time, then I have to try and look past it. Any case, I'm talking to myself here. Venue. Okay, so if we look at the carbon footprint from a venue perspective, it is a summary of the estimated amount of greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide equivalent, which is created through running the venue based on the clearly defined indicators and boundaries. Okay. So what we're looking at here based on the the corporate protocol is Scope 1 is your direct emissions, buildings and vehicles owned and managed. Scope 2 is energy indirect, which is your electricity. Scope 3 is your indirect emissions, upstream and downstream activities. Okay. I'll get to the indicators and the boundaries in a moment, but just to say that this is really based on the corporate protocol. On the other hand, you look at it from an events perspective. This is what the carbon emissions created through hosting the event, once again, based on clearly defined indicators and boundaries. But there are different protocol options to measure the impact. You can use a corporate protocol with Scope 1, 2, or 3, or you can use the product lifecycle protocol, which is an alternative protocol. And they should actually give you the same answer. It's just a different way of looking at it. So that's what, if you look at your carbon footprint, either for an event or for a venue or for a business, those are sort of the two different scenarios that you've got. Okay, can I just see, Kaylin, are there any questions that have come up? Does anybody want to specifically ask a question at this point in time? Anything that I see there is some chatter in the chat box. Let me just see, is there anything urgent that I need to respond to?
There are no questions for you, Grace.
Nothing yet. Okay. I'm going to just continue then. I'm going to start to move into what are the indicators. And I'm hoping that as I explain more and more, that these different building blocks start to fall into place. Okay, so focusing on indicators. Now, an indicator, it's a thing that indicates the state or level of something. That's what the dictionary says, a thing. Okay, so I like to use two different indicators or different types of indicators for events. Event indicator allows us to do a comparison between different events, but with specific criteria, such as the days of the event, the number of people, the size of the exhibition space, something like that. So different things that actually allow us to compare one conference to another conference, one exhibition to another exhibition, one hotel to another hotel, whatever the case may be. But you can actually start to compare apples with apples. And you can say, well, okay, these are all the 3-day events. These are all the 1-day events. You know, these are events under 500 people. These are events over 2,000 people. And you can actually start to look at your events, based on the size or the type of the event. Then we've got what we call performance indicators, and these are indicators that they review the performance of the event. So what is the amount of electricity used? What is the amount of water used? What is the amount of waste generated? And that then also is specific, related to the specific event. From a business point of view, or if you look at it like a hotel or a venue, a conference venue, then you're wanting to look at it again. What are your venue indicators so that you can actually do a baseline or a benchmark, or you can then also look at your performance indicators. So let me just move on, but just to say each indicator needs a very clear description and a standard unit so that it can actually be used for comparison. So what do we actually mean by that? Let me give you some examples. This is a set of indicators that we used for Meetings Africa, where we said, what are the number of participants? And you can see there year on year how it compares. Then you can say, okay, what was the energy in carbon emissions, the print media, the transport, excluding the flights, then your total carbon equivalent, and then your CO2 per person in ton. So what you are able to do, and I note here that these indicators are actually all in carbon emissions. I should have also just shown you the indicators here that actually says the energy in kilowatt hours, the print meter in sheets of paper, or whatever we used there, the flights and the distance flown, transport kilometers driven, okay? But I see that this table is sort of just one step further, looking at it all already compared in CO2e. But what this also allows us to do is to say, okay, what is the carbon emissions per person in ton, but per person? Okay, so you can see that 2018 we had actually dropped down to 0.35, where earlier on it was 0.49, 52, 63, and then it dropped down. So that it took us 3 years to be able to actually implement some of the things and get it in place. Another thing also was that over time we managed to improve the way in which we are measuring things. Here I also see 2018 we had fewer flights that were coming in as well. Actually, what happened there, the shift was from less international flights and more flights from Africa. So there were actually more flights, but the carbon footprint was quite a bit lower. But this then allows you to, I'm just trying to show how over time you can start to see how you can actually compare things. Here you can actually better see the actual indicators that we measured. So you can see, for example, on the left, we've got our event indicators. So you've got the number of exhibitors, you've got the number of days for the event, the number of actually visitors that were there. And then, well, we gave the venue there as well. And then also on the green at the top, we look at what are the actual tons of CO2. On the right-hand side, you've actually got the indicators. So you can actually say, right, we had a total of 207 flights that were actually flown. We had 3,381 kilowatt hours of electricity consumed. We didn't have any data for the accommodation, but we know how much kilograms of waste recycled, we sent to landfill. We know how far we drove. We know how many trees we planted. And these are indicators that, as I said, they each have a description of what it is, and then a unit to say it's a kilogram or a liter or a sheet of paper or whatever the case may be. And then this you can then start to compare year on year so that you can actually see how does it actually change. This was the 2019 indicators and then the 2020 indicators. So the indicators then allow you just to understand year on year how your kilometers or your electricity is changing, or how your waste is improving, or whatever the case may be. Okay, so we then use these indicators to transfer it across to carbon emissions. But firstly, you need to have your indicators in place. And that's why it's very important to clearly identify your indicators. For the Netball World Cup, we also had a range of event indicators. This also looked at the total number of people that were involved, the total number of teams that participated, the total number of days the tournament ran, and the total number of courts that were actually used for the Netball World Cup that was held in Cape Town last year. So this then allows us that if they have the next Netball World Cup, they will most likely have 16 teams again, but maybe the tournament days are longer or shorter, or the setup takes a lot longer or shorter. And you can then start to actually compare like for like. And you can actually know also, but if you say there were a total of 43,000 people, what does that include? Does that include or exclude the volunteers? Is it just the visitors? What about the organizing committee? Does it include or exclude them? So by providing a breakdown like this allows the next Netball World Cup to be able to know, okay, let's use the same criteria so that we can actually also compare like for like from one event to another event. These were the key performance indicators that we used for the Netball World Cup. Again, it was on the left-hand side, you can see the event indicators, the number of teams, the tonnage of the carbon emissions, the number of courts, kilograms per person, the total build-up breakdown and including the event and how many people were there. Then on the right-hand side, you can see it's water, waste, paper used, diesel used, distance, the freight distance for sprung floors by boat and by truck, distance flown, accommodation, everything is here. So for your event, you need to go and you need to say, okay, what are the key performance indicators that we can actually measure for this event? How do we get that? How do we make sure we've got the right indicators? And how do we actually track that? Same for whether it's a hotel or a venue or your own business. How do you track the distance flown for business? Because you constantly flying staff around the country. How do you have a system in place to track what is the actual distance flown and what do we actually need to look at when we look at that specific indicator? Okay. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So indicators, you need to identify the core indicators that can be used to measure the impact of your venue, your event, your business, your house, whatever it is. If you don't have your core indicators, that actually that you can say, these are the things that we're measuring it, then you're not going to measure it. It's just as simple as that. So firstly, go and identify what are the indicators you're wanting to measure. What you're wanting to look at is scope 1 and 2. So definitely, what do you own and manage? So the building, the trucks, things like that. You can measure that and you can actually know what's happening. And then secondly, what is your electricity that's consumed? Okay, what you own and manage. The level scope 3, don't worry about that now. If you can get the rest right, then you can get scope 3 right later. But start with at least knowing what you're wanting, what you can measure, what you've got data available for, and what is actually realistic. Okay, you can decide what indicators you want to measure, but it is easier if you've got standard indicators that allows for a comparison, for a baseline and for a benchmark. Here, I just want to touch on those two words. Just to say baseline, meaning the first time you measured it, and that baseline is then from where you work forward to say, next time, what do we compare it back to? We compare it back to the baseline the first time we measure it. Over time, maybe over 5-6 years, you'll get to a point where you say, okay, I want to reestablish my baseline. The first 3 years we measured, we never got hold of the accommodation information. Now we've got it. Now we want to reestablish the baseline so that when we actually look at where we're standing, we've got a more realistic figure. That's totally acceptable to, over time, also reestablish your baseline, but it's good to know where your baseline was, where you actually started. And then benchmarking, that is to allow you to compare yourself with others, whether it is from one event to another, whether it is from one hotel or one conference venue to another, whether it is from one business to another. Benchmarking allows you to compare yourself to your peers and to know if you're actually doing well or not. Because if you have got whatever, 3,000 kilograms of carbon emissions, what does that mean? Where do you stand? Is it good? Is it bad? How do you know? The only way you'll know is if you've got a baseline and you can say, well, 3 years ago we were on 4,000 kilos and now we're only on 3,000, so we're doing something right. Or you can look at a benchmark and you can say, well, our colleagues are all on 5,000 and we're on 3,000, so we must be doing something right, measuring something wrong. But we then know, are we in line with what's happening in the industry? So that term of baseline and benchmarking is quite important, just to understand those two. Then what is also very important is that indicators need to have a clear description. So what was the distance traveled? What was the accommodation, how many nights people stayed over, and how much was electricity used? But with that as well, you do need sometimes additional information, such as with transport and flights. It's not just the distance flown with flights. You also do need to know the class of the flight, and I'll explain a little bit more why. But sometimes is for indicator, it needs more than just what you think it might be. It's not just about the number of cars that were at the event. That's not going to tell me anything. I actually need to know the distance that those vehicles driven. I also need to know if it is actually a petrol or a diesel car, because that also impacts on things. So a very clear description, and then also a very clear unit of measurement, so that everybody actually measures it the same. Okay, so that's a wrap up on indicators, just that you can decide your indicators, but very clear on what you want to measure. And once you can actually identify that and measure it, stick with it, because that's what you're then going to use for doing your actual carbon footprint. Okay, next one, moving on. What are the boundaries? So when we look at something, you need clear boundaries to know what is in, what is out. The easiest is usually to have a practical financial boundary, but also important to consider pre-event, main event, post-event. So just as an example, Netball World Cup, that was August last year. And in March that year, they had what did they call it? It was a preparation event. It had a different name, but basically it had 4 teams participating, and they tested the venues, see how things would work. So it was like a bit of a dry run. Is that inside or outside of the carbon footprint? What do you include? What do you exclude? And this is very important, that you've got a very clear way to know how you actually do this, and that you can clearly indicate what is included or excluded. Now, again, the rule of thumb, if I can put it that way, is you can include and exclude technically whatever you like, as long as you can disclose it. So you can say, I've got this event, but excluding X, Y, and Z, but you must clearly disclose what you're excluding and why something is included or excluded. So let me just maybe explain that in a little bit more way. So the questions that come up is can you influence or control any of the activities? Can emissions be measured? Because if you can't measure them, you can't manage them. It's useless that you actually track them sometimes. Is it material? If it's not important, why are we measuring the small things if actually it doesn't make a difference? But also, is there a high stakeholder interest? So I'm going to just show you a boundary setting tree that we actually used for the Netball World Cup. So I've adapted it slightly. It's based on the Netball World Cup, but I did adapt it slightly just for the audience here. So what you start is on the top left corner. Firstly, is it in the budget? If it is, yes. Is it fully funded in the budget? Yes. Then we got to try a level base to include it into our boundary, into our carbon footprint. If we look at it, is it in the budget? And they say no, then we ask, well, is it an event-related activity? Oh, yes, it is. Okay. Then, okay, it's an event activity, but can we actually exert influence over it? Example here is that for the Netball World Cup, in preparation, they went all around the country with a trophy tour. And there were a lot of different events that happened in, I don't know how many small little towns. It took like a good 6 weeks to do this tour around the country. And every little municipality where they stopped, they wanted to have an event. They typically just put up banners, but then the local municipality will get people together and whatever. Can you actually influence anything over what happens in that little town? No. Is it part of the event? Yes. But do I have influence about what happens there? No, I don't. Then you can say, well, okay, then we're going to exclude that. Okay. But can we, is it something that we can actually have influence over? That, for example, would be the number of people that for the Netball World Cup actually flew in as part of the organizing committee. So we can actually influence who comes or doesn't, because it is also part of the budget. Okay. The next question is, can emissions be controlled and measured? For some, they can't be measured. A lot of them can be, and then we go to the next roll on the right. But if you actually say no, the carbon emissions can't be measured or can't be controlled or measured, then you say, well, okay, can we estimate the emissions? If we can't measure it and we can't estimate it, then it needs to be excluded. There's no ways you can include everything. But if you can't measure it, but you can actually estimate it in some way, then you can say, yes, okay, back on the table again. Then the question comes in, is it material? Is it really going to make a difference? Or is it actually such a small part of the bigger scheme of things? Then again, yes or no, whether you include it or not. So you say, no, it's not material to us. It will actually have a very small impact. But then the question is there a high stakeholder interest? And if they say yes, then it's back on the table. Example here is actually waste. So the greenhouse gas emissions associated with waste is very, very small, okay? But it has a high stakeholder interest because people want to know what's happening with the waste. And from that point of view, it is very important to measure and manage the waste correctly, and then to include it, but it's more from a stakeholder interest point of view than what it actually is from a materiality point of view. So that's a boundary setting tree. There can be different boundary setting trees. You can set up your own boundary setting tree related to the work that you are actually busy with. I'm just thinking of some of the work I'm doing on the side of exhibitions. And there also you can adapt this to sort of say, okay, for our exhibition, what is in, what is out, where we do we draw the boundary? So if we say we're wanting to do something that is carbon neutral, do we also pay for the other people or not? Let me actually not get ahead of myself and go to the next one and just show you some of the questions. And I see I'm almost out of time, so I better speed up a bit. Okay, so we're hosting an event, a concert, and we have an international band, in or out. So I was hoping I can get some participation. Can I see by raise of hands who says that? Just on your where is it? What's that called? No, I don't even have it. Comments. No, your fingers up. Show me if you can actually, if you think it needs to be in. If we're hosting a concert with an international band, do we actually include their flights into my carbon footprint or not? Can anybody give me this is going to be too tricky this way around. Let's look at now. We've got many.
Grace.
Yes.
Sorry. If you open the participant screen, you can see that 4 people have raised their hands. Okay. Actually, 4, 5, 6 people have raised their hands.
Okay. Already. Okay. So sorry, I can't see that. Thanks for bringing that under my attention. I think the way in which I'm looking at it, I can't quite see. But then, okay. So, no, I went to the no, I'm going too fast. Okay, so let me just, because of time, and just let me just move on here. So, with many of the festival goers,
don't worry about the time. You've got an extra 10 minutes because we started a bit late. So if you can,
yeah, but I know how much I've still got to do as well.
Just want some time.
Okay. I'm aware of my time. So, yeah. Okay. So, if you've got people, okay. So, if you've got lots of festival goers who'll be flying from overseas, while some will be traveling by car, what is in, what is out? Okay. The event requires a large stage and equipment to be transported. Do we include that? I mean, the equipment, you need to have it, but, you know, it's very expensive transporting the equipment, and they need a lot of big trucks. Food is being provided at the event for the staff, the bands, and the media at the cost of the event. So those guys are getting it for free. But food is also for sale to festival goers, which is being provided by food trucks, and the food trucks making money. So these are all different scenarios that I painted, and there's no hard and fast rule about what is in and out. But the easiest rule of thumb is it in your budget? So if you're hosting a concert and you are actually flying the international band in, or you are having to pay for the international band to be there, and in addition to that, you can't have your concert without them. So with the Netball World Cup, we couldn't have the Netball World Cup without the teams. So that had to be included into the carbon footprint. But with the festival goers flying in from overseas, as an organizer, you've got no control about who decides who to fly in or not, or who comes by car. So then that you can say is actually outside of your budget. You also don't pay for those flights in any way. Okay, so then you can say that is outside of the budget. You've got no control over it. You've got no idea of knowing where they flew from. So that you can then say is outside of your carbon footprint. The equipment that needs to be transported, that needs to be in your carbon footprint. You can't have that event without the equipment. So that is core to what you're doing. That's in. Food being provided at the event for staff, bands, and media, that's at the cost of the event. That needs to be included. Food for sale to the festival goers provided by the food trucks, that you can decide could be outside, because you don't know how many meals were sold or what happened there. Okay, so again, you can decide what is in or out. Using your finance boundary is the easiest to do, but whatever you do, you need to clearly define what you do include or exclude when you do your carbon footprint. So clear boundaries are needed to provide consistency. You can decide what these are, but please be open and transparent. And the easiest is the financial boundary. Okay, so that's just an overview of boundaries. Then I'm getting to the complicated part, and this is what are the actual emission factors. And I'm sorry we're only getting to this now, but I needed all the other bits to be able to get here. So different products or activities all have different emission factors. So as an example, there are different vehicles based on different types of fuel. So there are lots and lots of these different charts that I can show you, and then you go in and you go and select what is the actual carbon emissions that you need. So for example, just to show you, this is from DEFRA. I've downloaded this. I want to look at vehicle transport of passengers. So I have to select, it's a medium car that I've got. I've got the kilometers that they have driven. I know that is a petrol vehicle. So my carbon emission factor is 0.17726. Try and remember that, but understand that each of these items are different. However, if you look at a different one, now you've got a large car. Also, we're measuring in kilometers because we're still in South Africa. This one is diesel, not petrol. They will have an emissions factor of 0.20729. Okay, so every one of these different options have got a different emissions factor. A few more examples. Electricity from Eskom, that has got an emissions factor of 1.06 kilograms CO2. That's very high. A lot of the European countries, it's a lot lower. Even Mozambique is a lot lower than us. South Africa's is really bad. Let's look at something. We need to take transport things in a van. It's a 2-ton vehicle. We're doing it in kilometers. I can see what I've selected there. This one is in diesel. And then I can see that the emissions factor is 0.18832. If I look at it on the rigids, this is the heavy goods vehicles. Here I needed a 6-ton vehicle. I'm measuring it in kilometers. But here I look at, was it full? Was it empty? and then based on that, I said, well, it was 50% laden. So here I use an emissions factor of 0.49. If it was 100% laden, I would use an emissions factor of 0.53 for the distance that it actually traveled. So these are then the different things that you need to look at. If you've got a system in place and you can go back every time and just update it and get the information and you know what your emission factors are, it becomes relatively easy. But understanding where to find the emission factors is a little bit more difficult. Food, different types of food also have got different emission factors. This is unfortunately something that's not really standardized yet. For the Netball World Cup, I did quite a bit of research on this. These are the emission factors that I decided to use for the Netball World Cup. What I had to do then was disclose and say, this is what I've used. So anybody else coming afterwards wanting to look at how I did it or what I did, it's important that they can also know which emission factors were used. So it is actually important to disclose those emission factors. So in wrapping up on emission factor, this is a representative value that attempts to relate the quality of the pollutant released into the atmosphere with an activity associated with releasing that pollutant. So it is a way for us to actually measure the impact of whatever the carbon footprint impact from a pollutant point of view related to a specific activity, whether that is switching on a kettle or having a hot shower, which will relate to your electricity consumed, whether it is looking at the diesel generator, liters of diesel consumed, whether that is looking at the flight, so that will be your flight flown, the distance flown, but also the class that was flown, whether it is looking at the transportation of heavy goods, how far did that truck travel, how big was the truck, and how full was the truck. So there are various things to consider, but this is the reason why we ask for different information and why we need it in a specific way. Just to also say that the governments and authorities determine the emission factors. There will always be a certain percentage of uncertainty, but the main thing is that we actually use the same emission factors and that we stay up to date with that, and that you can easily also download from DEFRA. If you literally Google DEFRA carbon emissions, you can get all of them over there. Okay. Now, my last thing, and this is where the rubber hits the road, and I'll wrap up in 5 minutes. But how do you actually calculate the impact? So what you need to do and what you can do is identify your boundary, decide what is in or out. Then identify and measure the indicators with clear units. What are the things that you're going to measure and how you're going to measure it? So if you're measuring the vehicles, are you measuring kilometers or are you measuring liters of fuel used? You can use either one of those, but which one are you using, and keep it consistent. If you're looking at bed nights, how are you doing that? And what is the type of hotel where they're staying? If you're looking at flights, how many flights, how far did they fly, and what class was it? Okay, so identify and measure your indicators with clear units. Then you might need some help with the next step, which is identifying what is the actual emission factor for that activity, and then calculating your carbon footprint. So this is where carbon footprint analyst will come in. You will still need to know your boundary and have your indicators and hand that over to somebody who does your carbon footprint. And they will then go determine what is the emission factor and calculate your carbon footprint. If you are something like a hotel or a small B&B or a venue, and it's the same thing year in and year out, get your emissions factor sorted, put it in an Excel sheet. You can do this yourself, okay? It's not rocket science. It's pretty simple then. But what is important is that you are open and transparent with your report. So just to show you how we do it. So here, what did I give my hotel's name? This is the guest house on the corner. 12 months, we looked at what they used, their electricity, their generator, the diesel that they used in their generator, and then the liters of fuel that they used for their petrol that they used for their vehicles. Okay, tallied it up, end of the year, you've got the total there. So here you've got total of kilowatt hours of electricity used. Then you look at the bottom, those are the emission factors. So here the emissions factor was 1.06 kilograms per kilowatt hour, and that gave you a total of 690 kilograms of CO2 emissions. Sorry, I see on the right-hand side I omitted the kg. But it's the same thing throughout. If you want to look at liters of diesel, again, you look at what is the emissions factor. You say your diesels times your emissions factor gives you your kilograms of CO2 equivalent. Your petrol, again, what's the total? Look at your emissions factor, and then you just say liters petrol times your emission factor gives you your answer. So if you are an establishment doing it year on year, it's not rocket science. You can actually do it yourself. Units of measure times the emissions factor equals the carbon emissions, and then kilograms, you can also bring it down to tons. If you are looking at the event on the hill, here you can see electricity consumption, how much electricity was actually used in kilowatt hours, what is the emissions factor times amount versus times the emissions factor gives you the kilograms, accommodation, flight, local transport, everything. So if you've got your unit times your emissions factor, you get your carbon emissions. So if diesel, for example, here we've got 3,772 liters of diesel. That's important. That's what you need to measure. Then you look at what is your emissions factor. It's 2.6. Then you say, okay, what is that? Unit times emissions factor gives you 9,507 kilograms of CO2. And then you tally all of that up together and you can see what is your total carbon emissions for the specific imaginary event of mine. Okay, so just a few other indicators. Here you can see Netball World Cup. We had the different indicators, which we then used also to determine the carbon emissions. Here you can see these were all the land-based transport. So outside broadcasting vehicles had to drive down from Joburg to Cape Town. So they were most of the transport emissions came from that. Then there was local transfer and a lot of other things happening. So this is all just related to the local land-based transport. If you look at it from a catering perspective, this was the catering that based on weight. So most of the people, most of the people ate chicken, which was 1.5 kilograms. 1.5 tons of chicken versus 1.4 beef that was used. But now if you look at those two figures and just look at how the chart looks, and you look at this chart and you look at its beef and chicken again, you can see that the carbon footprint of beef is actually a lot higher. So the first graph showed you the kilograms of these items, and the second graph, this one, shows you the carbon emissions related to the beef and the chicken. And the carbon emissions for beef is a lot higher than what it is for chicken, which is why looking at it from a carbon emissions perspective, it paints a different story. Okay, so overall, at the end of the Netball World Cup, we could give them a carbon footprint per activity. Most of it was associated with the flights and the electricity, freighting of floors. That's where most of the event-related carbon footprint came from. Then a drop down at accommodation, catering, transport. You'll see that at the end of the day, that yellow line in the middle, that's a very small little yellow line. That is all the diesel in the generators and the waste and the water and the wastewater and the paper, which in the bigger scheme of things was actually very little for this event, because most of the event was actually, there were bigger things, but we still had to measure that because these were all things that are actually, they might not be material, they don't have such a big impact, but they are, the stakeholders want to actually know what are you doing with waste, and that is something that you always get nailed on very quickly with an event, so you have to measure that. Okay, so that's our carbon footprint per activity. Last point that I've got here, and I am over time, I do apologize, but what about carbon offsetting? So there are various options for carbon offsetting. I'm not going to go into the details because I've run out of time, but you've got the verified carbon standard. Go online, you can see a whole bunch of projects that you can then go and offset your carbon footprint with. The gold standard, that's another one. It's also available online. You can go and see what are the actual projects that are available that you can actually go and offset your carbon emissions with. ZAREC is the REX for South Africa. There you can also go, you can see where the projects are, and you can buy that for offsetting. Or Credible Carbon, they've also online. You can go and see what projects they've got available and what you would like to actually offset through carbon calculated. Credible Carbon, apologies, Credible Carbon. What is, however, important is I did a quick comparison here for the Netball World Cup. We wanted something where it was a verified registry, where we could actually know what the cost per ton was, and we wanted to know what was the reach and location, and we prefer to actually have something local. So Vera is actually international, but there are some local projects, but they couldn't give us a cost estimate per ton for the offsetting. The gold standard, also verified. You can see the cost there per ton varied quite a bit. And it is an international initiative, but they do also have local projects. If you look at ZAREC, the cost per ton came down a bit, which looked good, and it had South African projects, but it is based on international standards. In the end, with the Netball World Cup, we decided to go with Credible Carbon. They are also my preferred people who I work with. They are a verified registry. They've got a very cost-effective cost per ton for offsetting, and they are South African but based on international standards. So there are various options. You can offset how you want to, but if you're actually wanting to look at it and actually have a certificate saying that you offset, then this is what I would recommend. So, oops, close there. That was not for me. Golden rule for carbon emissions and offsetting: avoid what you can and offset what you can't. So firstly, don't just try and offset, but firstly avoid all the emissions that you can avoid. And then you go and you say, okay, if we can't avoid it, how do we offset it? Okay, so what should you do? My last slide. Set clear boundaries. Determine what is included or excluded. You can determine that, but you need to be very clear on where those boundaries are and what you include or exclude. Identify your indicators with clear descriptions and units of measure. Go sit down with your team and say, okay, this we want to measure. How do we measure it? And does that work for if we're wanting to convert that to our carbon footprint? So you look at what you're wanting to measure there, but identify your indicators. Monitor and track those indicators. So if it's a business, it might be that every month you need to track it. If it's an event, maybe it's prior, before, and after the event. So you need to see how you do that as well. But you need to make sure that those get monitored and tracked, that you actually have the data. Standard indicators can also assist with establishing a baseline and a benchmark. So speak to other people as well. It does help to have the standard indicators. Determine the emission factors that you actually want to use for your calculations. Here, it can be a bit of a minefield. It helps to speak to somebody who understands that. But once you've actually got those emission factors, you can do the calculations yourself. Be open and transparent with your carbon footprint report. Don't hide it. We are in a point in history where it is important that we can be open and transparent about these things. So please, even if your carbon footprint does not look good, please share it with others. Let others learn as well, and let others understand where they are standing in the bigger scheme of things as well. And then lastly, offset your carbon emissions that you can't avoid. And there are various ways of doing that. But firstly, try and just track it, monitor it, and understand it. And then at a later stage, when you're ready, you can actually offset it. From my side, that's it. I don't know if there are any questions. I'm happy to take questions and carry on. I do apologize for going over time. I do hope that it was worthwhile. I see we do still have 33 participants online. So I do hope that that was actually useful and valuable.
Thank you very much, Grace. It was most definitely useful and most definitely valuable. I think from the comments online, we've had Sue George saying this session and explanation has been so extremely useful. I really hope that we can secure the recording so we can explain it to our executives why we are doing what we are doing and when and why we are bothering with the carbon footprint. Then Michaela says, wow, amazing info, most valuable. Thank you so much. Jackie Nell, please can you share your presentation? It has been very valuable. Rebecca Phillips, really helpful information. Jacqueline Joshua, great session. So yeah, Justin Horse, well done, excellent session. And from our side of things, absolutely also, and as I said, extremely valuable and an excellent session. As always, Grace, these sessions that you have been doing are incredibly valuable, not only to us as the EGF and our members, but obviously for the planet. I'm not sure. I know that a lot of your info here is protected information, so I'm not sure if you are going to permit us to share the recording of this. But if it is, it will be posted on the EGF website or with our next newsletter. That obviously will be up to you, Grace. We do understand your intellectual property is yours, and we do understand if you prefer not for this presentation to be shared.
I'm happy to share this. I haven't used any proprietary information or anything that I do often use in other presentations. So I'll be happy if this one is shared. And if anybody does have any questions, give me a shout. A lot of these things, it's as I say, it's not rocket science. And I really felt very strongly that I wanted to debunk the mystification around carbon footprinting. I've had so many people say that it's too expensive and it's too difficult, and it's not. Look, it's not the easiest thing. And I'll tell you, when you do something like the Netball World Cup one, you go around in circles because it is a huge event with a lot of different elements. But a lot of the smaller events, smaller venues, you can do it. Just start with the basics, and that is why I just also try to explain the basics in a very basic manner. And I'd really like to encourage you to, work with that. And if you do have questions, do feel free to reach out to me.
Well, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. It's always good to make a start. And I can concur with what you say. It looks daunting, but it actually isn't. Last year, I worked together with yourself and Mwesi on an event that I did, and we did the carbon footprint measuring. And in the beginning, I thought, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to get through this. But as you said, and with your guidance and as you showed us with the boundaries and the indicators, once you've decided on those, it's actually quite easy, and you get everybody to give you the right information that you need, and you find a way to collect it all. It actually works out very easy because the carbon footprint calculator, as you see, it's actually quite simple to get to that carbon emissions per attendee quite easly if you just prepare yourself and get all the right paperwork done in advance. It's like anything. If you don't make a start, you're never going to make the end. So as the chairperson of the Event Greening Forum, I'd like to encourage our members to start small with this, even if it's you in the office, just calculate, your car usage for a month when you go to meetings and up and down and how much electricity you use in your office and things like that. I mean, all of these things should be able to be gotten from your meter readings and things like that. So please make a start. That's what being part of the Event Greening Forum is all about. It's about calculating what we are contributing to the atmosphere, because I'd hate to show that as our members and we don't do what we do and according to our constitution, and then we get accused of greenwashing. So let's not be one of those members that merely make use of the EGF's logo as a way to greenwash. So I really would like to encourage our members and share, as Grace says, share the information with us so we can start putting a data record together. And of course, with the Net Zero Carbon Events Initiative, they also need this information information, and unfortunately Africa is very slow to respond. They're getting global information, but from Africa they're still very far behind. And on that note, I know we're running out of time. The Net Zero Carbon Events Initiative are busy working on a calculator that they are going to make available free to all Net Zero Carbon Events Initiative signatories and supporters, that will enable you to calculate your carbon footprint online. And we will have Alex Ellis from GIMIC and NZCE one of these days when they're ready to release that carbon footprint calculator to the global audience.
But you need the data to input. So start measuring.
Exactly.
Get your
You can't measure what you don't know. As you say, Grace, you can't measure what you don't know. So start collecting the data so that we can start inputting it into that calculator. And then on that note, in closing, I would just like to once again say thank you very much to our two presenters today, to Sandro from Trigger. Thank you very much for sharing what Trigger is doing in the eventing environment and sustainably and green. Very excited to hear that. So please, if you have any more questions, you can get hold of Sandro at Trigger. And then, of course, Grace, as always, it is absolutely incredible. You are always mesmerizing with what you present to us. We're always grateful to have you, and we look forward and are excited to the next presentation. So thank you. And then, of course, to our sponsors for today's event, our Patreon members, the Solutions Company and Event Synthesis, thank you. This would not have been possible without your contribution. So thank you very much. Last but not least, we are going to be doing another webinar on event logistics and how that impacts on the green environment. And Kaylin will be sending out the information on when that's going to happen. So we hopefully will have you join us on that webinar very soon. The information will be in the webinar, will be emailed to you, as well as on the WhatsApp group. Everybody, thank you very much for an incredible session. Sorry we went over, but I'm sure you forgive us, and I'm sure you were very happy that we ended up getting the full presentation from Grace. On that note, go out there, save the planet, and thank you very much for being part of today's sessions. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful green week.